The ice beneath Zelda Brennan's boots cracked like a gunshot, and in the span of a heartbeat, the world tilted sideways as the rotted wooden bridge gave way beneath her weight, plunging her into water so cold it felt like 1,000 knives piercing her skin all at once. She had been crossing Timber Creek on her way back from the Mercantile in Rawhide, Nevada, her arms loaded with supplies for the small boarding house her mother ran on the edge of town, and now those packages were sinking into the murky depths, along with her heavy winter coat that dragged her down like an anchor. The February afternoon sun did nothing to warm the snowmelt that rushed through the creek, swollen from the unusually harsh winter of 1883, and Zelda's lungs seized as the frigid water closed over her head, her mouth opening in a silent scream that only filled with more icy water. She had never learned to swim properly, having grown up in a household where young ladies were taught embroidery and proper etiquette rather than practical survival skills, and panic flooded through her as completely as the water that surrounded her. Her skirts tangled around her legs, the heavy wool and cotton layers that had kept her warm on the walk now becoming a death trap that pulled her deeper into the creek's deadly embrace. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, and it yanked her downstream, tumbling her over and over until she no longer knew which way was up. Her lungs burned with the need for air, and black spots began to dance across her vision as her body screamed for oxygen. Through the distorted lens of the water, she saw a dark shape plunge into the creek above her, and then strong arms wrapped around her waist, hauling her upward with a force that seemed almost superhuman. Her head broke the surface and she gasped, choking and coughing as water streamed from her nose and mouth, her body convulsing with the cold and the shock of what had just happened. The man who held her kicked powerfully against the current, one arm locked around her rib cage, while the other cut through the water, propelling them toward the muddy bank, where dead grass poked through patches of melting snow. When they reached the shore, he lifted her bodily from the water and carried her several yards from the creek's edge before setting her down on a relatively dry patch of ground. Zelda collapsed onto her hands and knees, retching up what felt like half the creek, while her entire body shook so violently her teeth clattered together like castanets. She was dimly aware of the man moving around her, of his boots squelching in the mud, and then a heavy coat settled over her shoulders, still warm from his body heat. "We need to get you warm right now," he said, his voice urgent and rough with exertion. "My horse is just up the ridge. Can you stand?" Zelda tried to answer, but her jaw was shaking too hard to form words, so she simply nodded, though even that small movement seemed to require more energy than she possessed. The man did not wait for further confirmation. He scooped her up again, this time cradling her against his chest as he strode up the sloping bank with sure, quick steps. Through her chattering teeth and blurred vision, Zelda caught her first real look at her rescuer. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair plastered to his head from the creek water, and a strong, angular face that might have been carved from granite. His eyes were a startling shade of blue-gray, like storm clouds, and they held a fierce determination as he carried her toward a large bay horse that waited patiently near a stand of cottonwood trees. "My mother," Zelda managed to gasp out between shivers. "Boarding house, east side." "I know it," the man said shortly. He set her on her feet long enough to mount his horse, then reached down and pulled her up in front of him with an ease that spoke of considerable strength. He wrapped his arms around her, gathering the reins, and kicked the horse into a gallop that sent them flying across the winter-brown landscape toward the collection of buildings that made up Rawhide. The ride passed in a blur of cold and confusion. Zelda was aware of the man's warmth against her back, of the way his arms created a shelter around her trembling form, of the rhythmic pounding of the horse's hooves against the hard-packed earth. She tried to stay conscious, tried to focus on anything other than the bone-deep cold that had invaded every part of her body, but the effort seemed immense. Her head lolled back against the man's shoulder, and she felt rather than heard the rumble of his voice as he spoke to her, urging her to stay awake, to keep fighting, to hold on just a little longer. When they reached the boarding house, the man dismounted in one fluid motion and pulled Zelda down into his arms. He kicked open the front gate and strode up the path to the porch, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden steps. The door flew open before he could knock, and Zelda's mother, Margaret Brennan, stood framed in the doorway, her face going white as she took in the sight of her daughter's soaked and shivering form. Sweet, merciful heaven, Margaret breathed, then snapped into action with the efficiency of a woman who had raised 5 children and run a business for the past decade. Bring her to the back room, near the kitchen stove. Quickly now! The man carried Zelda through the tidy front parlor and down a narrow hallway to a small bedroom that served as the family's private quarters. Margaret was already stripping blankets from the bed and stoking the fire in the small stove that heated the room. She turned to the man with sharp, assessing eyes. We need to get her out of these wet clothes immediately. Thank you for bringing her home, mister. Samuel Calloway, the man said, setting Zelda gently on a chair near the stove. I have a ranch about 5 miles north of town. I was checking fence lines when I saw her go through the bridge. Then we owe you my daughter's life, Mr. Calloway, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion, even as her hands worked quickly to unbutton Zelda's soaked dress. If you will excuse us, I need to attend to her now. Please go warm yourself by the kitchen fire and help yourself to coffee. I will speak with you shortly. Samuel hesitated, his eyes lingering on Zelda's pale face and blue-tinged lips, but he nodded and left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Zelda was barely aware of her mother's ministrations as Margaret stripped away the wet layers of clothing and began rubbing her daughter's frozen limbs with rough towels, trying to restore circulation and warmth. She wrapped Zelda in flannel nightgowns and piled blankets over her, then pressed a hot water bottle against her feet and another against her chest. Foolish girl, Margaret murmured, though her voice was tender rather than scolding. That bridge has been unsafe for weeks. The creek master was supposed to have it repaired before the thaw. Zelda wanted to explain that she had not known, that the bridge had looked sturdy enough from a distance, but the words would not come. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the warmth from the stove and the blankets begin their slow work of thawing her frozen body. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of voices in the other room, of the low rumble of Samuel Calloway's voice mixing with her mother's higher tones, of the comforting sounds of the boarding house settling around her. When she finally woke fully, the room was dark except for the glow from the stove, and her mother sat in a chair beside the bed, her head bowed over some mending. Zelda stirred, and Margaret immediately set aside her work, leaning forward to press a cool hand against Zelda's forehead. How do you feel, darling? Like I swallowed half the creek, Zelda said, her voice hoarse and raw, and like every part of me was frozen solid and then thawed too quickly. Margaret's lips quirked in a small smile. That is not far from the truth. You gave me a terrible fright. When Mr. Calloway came riding up with you in his arms, I thought... She stopped, swallowing hard. Well, it does not matter what I thought. You are safe now, thank the Lord. Is he still here? Zelda asked, remembering the strong arms that had pulled her from the water, the warmth of his body during that wild ride back to town. Mr. Calloway? No, he left several hours ago, though not before I thanked him properly and invited him to dinner tomorrow evening. I told him you would want to thank him yourself once you had recovered. Margaret stood and smoothed her skirts. I will bring you some broth. You need to eat something to rebuild your strength. Over the next few days, Zelda's body recovered from its ordeal, though she found herself plagued by vivid dreams of drowning, of being pulled under by unseen hands, of struggling against currents too strong to fight. Each time she woke, gasping, her heart pounding, she reminded herself that she was safe, that she was alive, because a stranger had risked his own life to save hers. She found herself thinking about Samuel Calloway at odd moments, wondering about the man who had jumped into freezing water without hesitation, who had held her so carefully as he rode through the cold. When the evening of the dinner arrived, Zelda took extra care with her appearance, pinning her dark hair into a neat arrangement at the nape of her neck and choosing a dress of deep green wool that brought out the color of her hazel eyes. She told herself it was simple courtesy that anyone would want to look presentable when thanking someone for saving their life, but there was a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with curiosity about the man with storm cloud eyes. Samuel arrived precisely on time, dressed in clean clothes that marked him as a working rancher rather than a town dandy. He had scrubbed away the mud and creek water, and in the lamplight of the boarding house parlor, Zelda could see that he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 26 or 27 to her own 22 years. He held his hat in his hands and nodded respectfully to Margaret before his gaze found Zelda standing near the fireplace. "Miss Brennan," he said, his voice carrying the same steady calm she remembered from the creek. "It is good to see you looking so well." "Thanks to you, Mr. Calloway," Zelda said, moving forward to offer her hand. "I am told I owe you my life. I am not sure how one adequately expresses gratitude for such a gift, but please know that I am deeply, profoundly grateful for your bravery and quick action." Samuel's hand engulfed hers, warm and calloused from hard work. Anyone would have done the same. "But you were the one who did it," Zelda said firmly. "You did not hesitate, even though that water was cold enough to kill. You put yourself at risk for a stranger." Something flickered in Samuel's eyes, an emotion Zelda could not quite name. "I could not have lived with myself if I had not tried," he said simply. "When I saw you go through that bridge, there was no decision to make. There was only action." Margaret invited them to the dining room, where she had prepared a meal that was impressive by boarding house standards: roasted chicken, potatoes with gravy, fresh bread, and dried apple pie for dessert. The other boarders had been invited to eat earlier, giving the family and their guests privacy for the meal. As they ate, conversation flowed more easily than Zelda had anticipated. Samuel spoke about his ranch, which he had inherited from his uncle 2 years earlier. He ran cattle primarily, with a small herd of horses that he was building up with careful breeding. The work was hard and often lonely, he admitted, but there was a satisfaction in building something with his own hands, in watching the land respond to good stewardship. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, but Zelda found herself captivated by his words, by the picture he painted of life on the open range. When he asked about her own life, Zelda explained that she had been helping her mother run the boarding house since her father's death 5 years earlier. It was respectable work, she said, and it allowed them to maintain their independence without relying on charity or distant relatives. She had 3 older brothers who had moved away to seek their fortunes in California and Colorado, and a younger sister who had married a shopkeeper in Carson City. The boarding house kept her and her mother busy, but it was a good life, surrounded by the ever-changing parade of travelers and workers who passed through Rawhide. "Do you miss your family?" Samuel asked. "Your brothers and sister?" Zelda considered the question carefully. "I miss them," she said slowly, "but I do not regret staying here. My mother needed me, and I could not imagine leaving her alone. Besides, I like Rawhide. It may not be as grand as San Francisco or Denver, but it is home. I know everyone and everyone knows me. There is comfort in that." "There is," Samuel agreed. "I grew up in Montana, near Helena. When my uncle wrote asking me to come help with the ranch, I was not sure I wanted to leave, but now I cannot imagine being anywhere else. This land gets into your blood somehow." After dinner, Margaret excused herself to attend to some household matters, leaving Zelda and Samuel to sit by the fire in the parlor. The conversation continued, touching on everything from books they had read, to their opinions on the coming railroad expansion, to their memories of growing up in the rough and tumble West. Zelda found herself laughing at Samuel's dry observations about some of his more eccentric neighbors, and she noticed that when he laughed, his whole face transformed, becoming younger and more open. "I should go," Samuel said finally, though he made no immediate move to rise. "I have an early start tomorrow, and I have taken up enough of your evening." "You have taken up nothing that was not freely given," Zelda said. "Mr. Calloway, I hope this will not be the last time we see you. You are welcome here any time you are in town. Samuel met her eyes, and Zelda felt a jolt of connection, as though something unspoken but significant had just passed between them. I would like that very much, Miss Brennan. Perhaps I could call on you again next week, if that would be acceptable to you and your mother. It would be very acceptable, Zelda said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. True to his word, Samuel returned the following week, and then the week after that, until his visits became a regular occurrence that Zelda found herself anticipating with an eagerness that surprised her. He always brought something small, a handful of wildflowers that grew on his property, a book he thought she might enjoy, fresh eggs from his chickens. They would sit in the parlor, or, when the weather warmed, walk through town together, talking about everything and nothing. Margaret watched these developing courtship rituals with approval, though she was careful never to leave them entirely alone together, mindful of propriety. But she saw the way her daughter's face lit up when Samuel arrived, the way she took extra care with her appearance on the days he was expected, and she recognized the signs of genuine affection growing between them. As spring arrived in Nevada, turning the brown landscape green and filling the air with a scent of sage and new growth, Zelda found herself falling in love with Samuel Calloway. It was not the dramatic, overwhelming passion described in the novels she sometimes read, but rather a steady, growing certainty that this was a man she could trust, could build a life with, could love for all the days she had remaining. Samuel, for his part, had been half in love with Zelda from the moment he had pulled her from the creek, though he would never have admitted it in such dramatic terms. There had been something about the way she fought against the current, about her determination to survive, that had called to something deep within him. As he got to know her through their visits, that initial attraction had deepened into something more substantial. He admired her intelligence, her dry wit, her devotion to her mother, and her practical approach to life. She was not a delicate hothouse flower, but a woman who understood the realities of Western life and met them with courage and grace. By the time summer arrived, bringing with it the intense heat that baked the Nevada desert, Samuel knew he wanted to marry Zelda Brennan. The problem was finding the right moment to ask her. He was not a man comfortable with flowery speeches or grand gestures, and he worried that his proposal would be too plain, too ordinary, for a woman who deserved poetry and romance. The opportunity came unexpectedly on an evening in late June. Samuel had invited Zelda to come see his ranch, with Margaret's approval and the understanding that one of the boarders would serve as chaperone for the journey. Mrs. Henderson, a widow in her 60s who had been living at the boarding house for the past year, agreed to accompany them, though she spent most of the ride dozing in the back of the wagon. When they arrived at the ranch, Zelda was immediately charmed by the neat cabin Samuel had built, the well-tended corrals, and the sweeping views of the surrounding mountains. Samuel showed her around with obvious pride, pointing out improvements he had made and plans he had for future expansion. They walked out to a small rise behind the cabin where a stand of aspens provided shade, and Samuel spread a blanket so they could sit and watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Mrs. Henderson had settled herself on the porch with a book, far enough away to provide propriety, but close enough to serve as chaperone. Samuel sat beside Zelda on the blanket, acutely aware of her nearness, of the way the fading light caught in her hair and turned it to burnished mahogany. "In Zelda," he said, then stopped, searching for the right words. "I need to tell you something." She turned to look at him, her hazel eyes curious. "What is it, Samuel?" He took a deep breath, deciding that plain honesty was better than fumbling attempts at eloquence. "When I pulled you out of that creek 4 months ago, I thought I was simply doing what any decent person would do. But from the moment I saw you, even soaked and half frozen, I felt something I had never felt before. Getting to know you these past months has only made those feelings stronger. You are the finest woman I have ever met, Zelda Brennan, and I cannot imagine my future without you in it." Zelda's breath caught, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. "Samuel." "I know I am just a rancher," Samuel continued, the words coming faster now, as though he needed to get them all out before he lost his courage. I cannot offer you a fancy life in a big city. This ranch is remote and the work is hard, and there will be times when money is tight and the winters are long. But I can offer you my whole heart. I can offer you a partner who will stand beside you through whatever comes. I can offer you a home built with my own hands and land that will be ours to pass down to our children. He reached out and took her hand in both of his. Will you marry me, Zelda? Will you take a chance on this life with me? For a long moment, Zelda could not speak past the lump in her throat. She thought about the life Samuel was offering, so different from the one she had imagined for herself as a girl. There would be no easy comforts, no society gatherings, no neighbors just down the street. But there would be this man who had jumped into freezing water without hesitation to save her life, who brought her wildflowers and listened when she talked, who looked at her as though she was the answer to every question he had ever asked. Yes, she said, her voice breaking on the word. Yes, Samuel, I will marry you. The joy that spread across Samuel's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Zelda felt a rightness settle over her, a sense that this was exactly where she was meant to be. When he kissed her, gentle and reverent, she felt the last of her doubts melt away. They returned to town as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Mrs. Henderson beaming at them from the back of the wagon, delighted to have been present for such a momentous occasion. Margaret took one look at her daughter's glowing face and knew immediately what had happened. She embraced them both, tears streaming down her cheeks as she welcomed Samuel into the family. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small church at the center of Rawhide. It was a simple ceremony attended by half the town, many of whom remembered the dramatic rescue from the creek and felt invested in the romance that had bloomed from that terrifying day. Zelda wore a dress of cream-colored silk that her mother had carefully preserved from her own wedding, altered to fit Zelda's slimmer frame. Samuel wore a new suit that the town tailor had made specially for the occasion, and he stood at the altar with such obvious love shining in his eyes that more than one woman in attendance dabbed at tears before the ceremony even began. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, promising to love and honor each other through all the days of their lives. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed his bride with such tender passion that the congregation burst into spontaneous applause. They walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, ready to begin their new life as a married couple. The celebration that followed was held at the boarding house, with Margaret going all out to create a feast worthy of her daughter's wedding day. There was music and dancing, laughter and toasts, and enough food to feed everyone twice over. As the evening wore on and the sun set over the Nevada desert, Samuel and Zelda slipped away from the party, climbing into the wagon that would carry them to their new home. The ride to the ranch was peaceful, the summer night warm and filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of coyotes. Zelda leaned against her husband's shoulder, still marveling at the fact that she could call him that now. Husband. The word felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. When they arrived at the cabin, Samuel insisted on carrying Zelda over the threshold, despite her laughing protests that it was an old-fashioned custom. He set her down gently in the main room, which glowed with the light of oil lamps he had left burning. Zelda looked around, seeing the care Samuel had taken to make the cabin welcoming for her arrival. There were wildflowers on the table, fresh curtains at the windows, and a beautiful quilt on the bed that she recognized as the handiwork of Mrs. Henderson. "Welcome home, Mrs. Calloway," Samuel said softly, and Zelda felt her heart swell with love for this man who had saved her life in more ways than one. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, a joining not just of bodies, but of souls. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, listening to the night sounds outside the cabin walls, and Zelda felt a contentment so deep it seemed to fill every part of her being. The first months of marriage brought adjustments and challenges. Zelda had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, so different from the routines of the boarding house. She learned to cook on the wood stove, to tend the kitchen garden, to care for the chickens and collect eggs. She learned to recognize the moods of the cattle and horses, to read the weather signs that Samuel pointed out, to appreciate the vast silence of the open land. There were difficult moments too. The isolation was harder than she had anticipated, and there were days when she desperately missed her mother and the constant company of the boarding house. The work was physically demanding, leaving her exhausted at the end of each day. And there were times when the reality of their tight finances worried her, when she lay awake calculating whether they would have enough to get through the winter. But through it all, there was Samuel. He was patient with her mistakes, encouraging when she felt overwhelmed, and endlessly appreciative of everything she did to make their house a home. He never dismissed her concerns or belittled her feelings, and he worked tirelessly to build their ranch into something that could support them comfortably. In turn, Zelda learned to read her husband's moods, to know when he needed space to work through a problem and when he needed her support. She discovered that he had nightmares sometimes, dreams of disasters he could not prevent, and she held him through those dark moments, offering the same steady strength he had shown her. Their first winter together was harsh, with snowstorms that lasted for days and temperatures that plunged well below zero. They were snowed in for nearly 3 weeks in January, confined to the cabin with only each other for company. It could have been a trial, but instead Zelda found herself treasuring that time. They played cards by lamplight, read aloud from books they had both loved, and talked about their dreams for the future. They made love in front of the fire, wrapped in quilts, and fell asleep in each other's arms while the wind howled outside. When spring returned, bringing with it the promise of new life, Zelda discovered she was carrying their first child. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited to tell Samuel until she was certain, wanting to give him the news in a special way. She chose an evening when he returned from a long day of fence repair, tired and dusty, but smiling when he saw her waiting on the porch. "I have something to tell you," she said, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. Samuel's expression shifted to concern. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Zelda assured him quickly. "In fact, everything is very right. Samuel, we are going to have a baby. In November, I think." For a moment, Samuel simply stared at her, his face blank with shock. Then, as the meaning of her words sank in, a grin split his face from ear to ear. He let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around before setting her down carefully, as though she had suddenly become made of spun glass. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to be parents. Zelda, this is the best news I could have imagined." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months, though the heat made Zelda uncomfortable, and the morning sickness that plagued her first trimester seemed poorly named as it struck at all hours of the day. Samuel fussed over her constantly, trying to take over her chores and insisting she rest more. Margaret came to visit for a week in July, bringing baby clothes she had been sewing and offering advice based on her own experiences. As autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Zelda grew large and awkward, her body preparing for the momentous task ahead. Samuel became increasingly nervous as her due date approached, worried about the many things that could go wrong in childbirth. They had arranged for the town's midwife, Mrs. Foster, to come stay at the ranch when Zelda's time drew near, but Samuel still felt helpless in the face of what his wife would have to endure. On a cold November morning, 3 days before Zelda's 23rd birthday, her labor began. Samuel rode to town at breakneck speed to fetch Mrs. Foster and Margaret, then spent the next 18 hours pacing the main room of the cabin while the women attended to Zelda in the bedroom. He could hear her cries of pain through the closed door, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. He remembered pulling her from the freezing creek, remembered the terror he had felt that he might lose her, and that same fear gripped him now. When the baby's first wail finally cut through the air, Samuel's knees nearly buckled with relief. A moment later, Mrs. Foster opened the door, her face wreathed in smiles. "Mr. Calloway, you have a son," she announced. "A big, Healthy boy with excellent lungs, and your wife did beautifully. She is tired, but she wants to see you. Samuel entered the bedroom on shaking legs. Zelda lay propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion. But her eyes glowed with a fierce joy as she held a small bundle wrapped in soft blankets. Samuel approached the bed slowly, hardly daring to breathe, and Zelda pulled back the blanket to reveal a tiny red-faced baby with a shock of dark hair. "Meet your son," she whispered. "Samuel James Calloway, if you approve of the name." "It is perfect," Samuel said hoarsely. He reached out a tentative finger, and the baby's impossibly small hand wrapped around it with surprising strength. In that moment, Samuel felt his heart expand in ways he had never thought possible. This was his child, his son, born of the love he shared with this remarkable woman. Over the next weeks, they settled into the rhythms of new parenthood. Samuel Jr., whom they called Jamie from the start, proved to be a fairly easy baby, sleeping well and nursing strongly. Zelda marveled at the fierce love she felt for this tiny person, at how her entire world had shifted to revolve around his needs. Samuel was a devoted father from the start, taking over household chores so Zelda could rest, and spending every spare moment gazing at his son with wonder. Margaret stayed for 2 weeks after the birth, helping with meals and laundry and offering advice when needed. Before she returned to Rawhide, she pulled Samuel aside for a private conversation. "You have given my daughter a good life," she told him. "I see how happy she is, how loved she feels. Thank you for that, Samuel. Thank you for being the kind of man who jumps into frozen water without hesitation, in all the ways that matter." The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. The ranch slowly grew more prosperous as Samuel's careful management and hard work paid off. They were able to add on to the cabin, creating more living space and a proper parlor where Zelda could entertain the occasional visitors who made the journey from town. They purchased more cattle and expanded their grazing land, and Samuel developed a reputation for raising quality horses that could handle Nevada's tough terrain. Jamie grew from a baby into a rambunctious toddler with his father's storm cloud eyes and his mother's quick smile. He followed Samuel around the ranch like a shadow, absorbing everything about the animals and the land with the unquenchable curiosity of the very young. Zelda watched her husband and son together and felt her heart might burst from the happiness of it all. When Jamie was 2 years old, Zelda became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was harder, with more sickness and exhaustion, but she delivered a healthy baby girl in the summer of 1887. They named her Rose Margaret, after the wildflower Samuel had brought Zelda during their courtship and after Zelda's mother, who wept with joy at the honor. Rose was a different child than her brother had been, more temperamental and demanding, but Samuel doted on his daughter with a fierce protectiveness that made Zelda smile. Jamie took to his role as big brother with enthusiasm, always wanting to help care for the baby and showing her his treasures from around the ranch. Life on the ranch was not always easy. There were years when drought threatened their water supply and forced them to sell cattle at a loss. There were harsh winters when they lost animals to the cold and struggled to keep themselves fed and warm. There were moments of fear when one of the children fell ill or Samuel was injured while working with a difficult horse. But through it all, Zelda and Samuel faced each challenge as partners. They had learned to communicate honestly, to support each other's strengths, and shore up each other's weaknesses. Their love had deepened from the initial spark of attraction into something solid and enduring, a foundation upon which they built their entire lives. When Margaret's health began to fail, Zelda and Samuel brought her to live at the ranch, converting their bedroom into a comfortable space for her and moving themselves into the new addition. Margaret spent her final years surrounded by the love of her daughter and grandchildren, passing away peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning when the wildflowers were blooming across the Nevada hills. They buried her in a small cemetery on the ranch property, marked by a simple stone that Samuel carved himself. Jamie grew into a tall, strong young man who loved the ranch with the same passion as his father. He had a natural gift with horses and began developing his own breeding program before he was 16. Rose, true to her name, had a beauty that turned heads when they ventured into town, but she also had her mother's practical intelligence and her father's determination. She loved the ranch as fiercely as her brother did, though her interests ran more toward the business side, keeping books and managing accounts with a skill that impressed even the bank manager in Rawhide. As the 19th century drew to a close, Samuel and Zelda found themselves looking back on nearly 2 decades of marriage with profound gratitude. They had built something lasting, not just in the physical structures of the ranch, but in the family they had created and the love they had nurtured. One evening in early February of 1899, 16 years almost to the day since Zelda had fallen through the rotted bridge, they took a walk together to the small rise behind the cabin where Samuel had proposed. The children were both away for the weekend, Jamie visiting a neighboring ranch to look at breeding stock, and Rose staying with friends in town, and the house felt strangely quiet without them. They stood together looking out over the land they had worked so hard to build, their fingers intertwined, their shoulders touching. The winter sun was setting, painting the sky in the same shades of orange and pink that Samuel remembered from the night he had asked Zelda to marry him. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked suddenly. "This life. I know it has been harder than you probably imagined when you agreed to marry me." Zelda turned to look at her husband, taking in the lines that time and weather had etched into his face, the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair, the strength that still showed in his broad shoulders and capable hands. He was 42 years old now, and she was 38, both of them solidly middle-aged, and she loved him more than she had thought it possible to love another human being. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "Samuel, you gave me a life beyond anything I could have dreamed when I was that foolish girl crossing an unsafe bridge with her arms full of packages. You have given me purpose, partnership, passion, and a family I treasure. How could I possibly regret any of that?" "You could have married someone else," Samuel said. "Someone who could have given you an easier life in town, with comforts and conveniences and neighbors nearby." "I did not want someone else," Zelda said. "I wanted you. I wanted this life with you. Even knowing all the hard times we would face, if I could go back to that day when you pulled me from the creek, I would make the same choice every single time." Samuel pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on top of her head. "I think about that day sometimes," he admitted. "I think about how close I came to losing you before I ever really found you. If I had been checking a different section of fence line, if I had been just a few minutes later, if the current had been stronger." "But none of those things happened," Zelda interrupted gently. "You were exactly where you needed to be, exactly when you needed to be there. Maybe that is just luck, or maybe it is something more. Either way, I am grateful for it every single day." They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The air was cold, promising frost overnight, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled its lonesome song. But Zelda felt warm and safe in her husband's arms, anchored by a love that had proven itself through time and trial. As they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, Zelda thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with terror and ice-cold water, with a stranger's courage and a desperate fight for survival. It had grown through quiet conversations and shared laughter, through the steady building of trust and affection. It had been tested by hardship and loss, by the inevitable challenges that came with building a life in a harsh and unforgiving land. But it had endured. Their love had endured, growing stronger and deeper with each passing year, until Zelda could no longer remember a time when Samuel was not the center of her world, the beating heart of her life. Inside the cabin, Samuel built up the fire while Zelda prepared a simple supper. They ate together at the table he had built with his own hands, talking about their plans for the ranch, about Jamie's progress with the horse breeding program, about Rose's idea to start a side business selling fresh eggs and butter to the growing number of settlers moving into the area. After dinner, they sat together by the fire, Zelda working on some mending, while Samuel read aloud from the newspaper that had arrived from Carson City earlier in the week. It was a peaceful, ordinary evening, the kind they had shared thousands of times over their years of marriage, and Zelda felt a deep contentment settle over her. Samuel, she said suddenly, interrupting his reading, do you remember what you told me the night you proposed? You said you could offer me a home built with your own hands and land that would be ours to pass down to our children. I remember, Samuel said, setting aside the newspaper. You have given me all of that and so much more, Zelda continued. You have given me a love story that started with you literally saving my life and has continued every day since as you save me in smaller, quieter ways. You save me from loneliness, from doubt, from fear. You make me better than I would be on my own. You are my hero, Samuel Calloway, not just because you pulled me from a frozen creek, but because you choose to love me every single day. Samuel crossed to where Zelda sat and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. And you are my heart, he said simply. You were from the moment I saw you fighting against that current, determined to survive. You have made me into the man I always wanted to be. You have given me a reason to build something lasting, something good. Every success I have, every moment of happiness, it all comes back to you. They kissed then, a kiss that held 16 years of love and partnership, of shared joys and weathered sorrows, of a bond forged in ice water and tempered in the fires of daily life. When they finally pulled apart, both had tears on their cheeks. The years continued to roll forward, bringing new challenges and new joys. Jamie married a young woman from a neighboring ranch, and they built a small house on the far corner of the Calloway property, expanding the family holdings. Rose surprised everyone by falling in love with a schoolteacher from back east who had come to Rawhide seeking adventure, and after a whirlwind courtship, they married and settled in town, where Rose used her business skills to help her husband establish a successful private academy. Samuel and Zelda became grandparents, first to Jamie's twin boys, and then to Rose's daughter and two more sons. The cabin that had once seemed so spacious when it was just the two of them now rang with the laughter and chaos of family gatherings, with multiple generations crowding around the extended table for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. As they entered their 50s, both Samuel and Zelda began to feel the weight of their years of hard work. Samuel's joints ached in cold weather, legacy of too many hours in saddles and too many injuries incompletely healed. Zelda's hands grew stiff with the beginnings of arthritis, making fine needlework difficult. But they adapted, learning to pace themselves and to accept help from their grown children. Jamie increasingly took over the day-to-day management of the ranch, though Samuel remained involved in major decisions and spent his days working with the horses he loved. Rose's business acumen helped the family navigate the changing economic landscape as the new century brought new technologies and new markets. Together, the family built something even larger and more enduring than Samuel and Zelda had imagined possible. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1908, their children organized a grand celebration, inviting friends and family from across the county. Nearly 100 people crowded into the main house and spilled out onto the porches and yard, all of them there to honor the couple whose love story had become something of a legend in Rawhide. The story of how Samuel had jumped into Timber Creek to save Zelda's life had grown in the telling over the years, embellished by time and repetition until it took on almost mythic proportions. People loved the romance of it, the drama of a stranger risking everything to save a drowning woman, of the love that blossomed from that moment of crisis. During the celebration, Jamie stood to offer a toast. To my parents, he said, raising his glass. They showed me that true love is not just about grand gestures, though Dad certainly made one when he pulled Mom from that frozen creek. True love is also about the small choices we make every day, to be kind, to be patient, to be partners in building something larger than ourselves. Rose added her own toast, speaking of her mother's strength and her father's tenderness, of the example they had set for what a marriage could be. Friends and neighbors added their own tributes, their own memories of the Calloway family's generosity and kindness over the years. Through it all, Samuel and Zelda sat together, their hands clasped, their eyes frequently meeting with the kind of wordless communication that comes from decades of intimate partnership. They were both graying now, their faces lined by time and weather, their bodies marked by years of physical labor, but the love between them still burned as brightly as it had on their wedding day. As the party wound down and the guests began to depart, Samuel and Zelda slipped away to their favorite spot on the rise behind the house. The summer evening was warm and clear, and they could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. 25 years, Zelda marveled. It seems like both a lifetime and no time at all. The best 25 years anyone could ask for, Samuel said, though I hope we have many more ahead of us. God willing, Zelda agreed. She leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the familiar solidity of him, the warmth of his presence. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not been there that day? If I had drowned in that creek? I try not to, Samuel admitted. The thought of a world without you in it is unbearable. Even now, after all these years, when you are out of my sight for too long, I feel a little anxious, a little unsettled. I think part of me will always be that man who pulled you from the water, terrified that I might lose you. You will never lose me, Zelda said firmly. Not in any way that matters. Even when one of us is gone from this earth, we will still be connected. You are written into my soul, Samuel Calloway, and nothing can erase that. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness fell, watching the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance. The sounds of the ranch settled around them, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of horses in the corral, the chirping of crickets in the grass. These were the sounds of home, of a life well lived, of love made manifest, in land and family. The years continued their inevitable march. Samuel and Zelda grew older, their bodies slowing but their minds remaining sharp, their love for each other undimmed by time. They watched their grandchildren grow, delighting in each milestone and accomplishment. They saw the ranch continue to prosper under Jamie's management, saw Rose's family thrive in town, saw the legacy they had built together extend into a third generation. On a cold February morning in 1915, 32 years after Zelda had fallen through the bridge into Timber Creek, Samuel woke to find his wife still sleeping beside him. It was unusual. She was typically an early riser, up before dawn to start the day's work. He started to wake her, then noticed how peaceful she looked, how relaxed, and decided to let her rest a while longer. He rose quietly and dressed, then went to start the fire in the kitchen stove. He was grinding coffee beans when he heard a cry from the bedroom. His heart lurched as he dropped everything and ran back, finding Zelda sitting up in bed, her hand pressed to her chest, her face contorted in pain. "Samuel," she gasped. "Something is wrong. My chest." He was at her side in an instant, easing her back against the pillows, even as he shouted for Jamie, whose house was close enough to hear. His son came running, took one look at the situation, and immediately rode for town to fetch the doctor. Samuel held Zelda's hand as they waited, talking to her constantly, telling her to hold on, to keep fighting, to stay with him. She gripped his hand with surprising strength, her eyes locked on his face. "Do not be afraid," she whispered. "Samuel, my love, do not be afraid. We have had such a beautiful life together." "We are going to have many more years," Samuel insisted, but even as he said it, he could see her slipping away, could feel the grip of her hand loosening. "Take care of our family," Zelda breathed. Tell them I love them, tell them." "Tell them yourself," Samuel said desperately. "Zelda, please, do not leave me. I cannot do this without you." She smiled then, a beautiful, peaceful smile that reminded him of the young woman he had fallen in love with 3 decades earlier. "You can do anything," she said. "You jumped into frozen water to save me, remember? You are the bravest man I have ever known. Only because you were worth saving, Samuel said, tears streaming down his face. Only because I could not imagine a world without you in it. And you gave me 32 wonderful years beyond that day, Zelda said. 32 years I would never have had without you. How many people can say they were given such a gift? How many people can say they were so completely, thoroughly loved? The doctor arrived an hour later, but there was nothing he could do. Zelda's heart, which had beaten steadily for 54 years, had simply worn out. She died peacefully in Samuel's arms, her last breath a gentle sigh, her last expression one of perfect contentment. The grief nearly destroyed Samuel. For days after the funeral, he could barely function, moving through the routines of daily life like a ghost. He had lost the center of his world, the partner who had walked beside him through every triumph and every trial. The ranch, the house, the land they had built together, all of it felt empty without her presence. But gradually, with the support of his children and grandchildren, with the demands of the ranch that still needed tending, Samuel began to find his way back to life. He would never stop missing Zelda, never stop feeling the absence of her like a missing limb, but he learned to carry that grief alongside the memories of their love. He told stories about her to his grandchildren, keeping her memory alive through tales of her courage, her humor, her wisdom. He tended her grave faithfully, planting wildflowers around the simple stone that read, Zelda Brennan Calloway, beloved wife and mother, 1861-1915. Jamie and his wife urged Samuel to move in with them, but he refused, choosing to remain in the cabin he had built with his own hands, where every corner held memories of Zelda. He could see her in the kitchen, humming as she prepared meals. He could hear her laughter in the parlor. He could feel her presence beside him when he lay down to sleep at night. 5 years after Zelda's death, on a spring morning when wildflowers bloomed across the Nevada hills, Samuel was working with a young horse in the training corral when he felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. He recognized it immediately for what it was, and his first thought was not of fear, but of relief. He was going to see Zelda again. Jamie found him a few minutes later, sitting peacefully against the corral fence, his eyes closed, a slight smile on his face. Samuel Calloway had died the way he had lived, quietly and without fuss, but leaving behind a legacy of love that would endure for generations. They buried him beside Zelda, under the aspens on the rise behind the cabin where he had proposed to her so many years before. At the funeral, Rose spoke about her father's greatest act of heroism, not the dramatic rescue from the frozen creek, but the everyday courage of loving someone completely, of building a life based on partnership and mutual respect, of choosing every single day to be the best man he could be. The ranch continued under Jamie's stewardship, and then under his sons, passed down through the generations along with the story of Samuel and Zelda, of a love that began with a leap into icy water and endured until death. The cabin remained standing for over a century, eventually restored and preserved as a historical landmark, a testament to one couple's vision and determination. Visitors who came to see the old Calloway Ranch homestead always asked about the two graves under the aspens, about the man and woman who had built this place. And the family members who gave tours always smiled and began the same way. It started on a cold February day in 1883, they would say. She fell through a rotted bridge into frozen water, and the cowboy jumped in and saved her life. But that was just the beginning of their story. And it was true. The rescue was just the beginning. The real story was in everything that came after, in the marriage they built through hard work and tenderness, in the family they raised with love and wisdom, in the land they stewarded with care and respect. The real story was in the thousands of small moments that made up a life lived together, in the quiet victories and shared sorrows, in the steadfast commitment to face whatever came as partners. Their great-great-grandchildren still lived on the land Samuel and Zelda had claimed, still told the story of how their love began, still honored the legacy of courage and devotion that had been passed down through the generations. The Calloway Ranch remained a working operation, proof that what Samuel and Zelda had built was meant to last, that love rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose could create something that transcended time. On February mornings, when ice still lingered in the shadows and Timber Creek ran high with snowmelt, if you stood very still near the old bridge site where Zelda had fallen so long ago, you could almost hear the echo of hoofbeats, almost see the image of a man on horseback, racing toward the water, preparing to make the leap that would change two lives forever. You could almost feel the power of that moment when one person chose to risk everything for a stranger, when fate or providence or simple chance put the right person in the right place at exactly the right time. And if you walked up to the cabin, to the graves under the aspens where Samuel and Zelda lay side by side, you would see that someone still brought wildflowers, that someone still tended the site with care. Because the story of Samuel and Zelda Calloway was not just a piece of family history, it was a reminder of what love could be when two people chose each other fully, when they built something together that was stronger than either could have created alone. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single act of courage, and that the most epic love stories are written not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of ordinary days, lived with extraordinary devotion. It was a reminder that when you save someone's life, you become responsible for it in the most beautiful way possible, and that when someone saves yours, you owe it to them to live that life as fully and as joyfully as you can. The Wild West had been full of dramatic stories, of gunfights and cattle drives, of fortunes won and lost, of lawmen and outlaws whose names became legend. But among all those tales of violence and adventure, the story that endured in Rawhide, Nevada, was the quieter story of Samuel and Zelda, of a cowboy who jumped into frozen water and the woman whose life he saved, of two people who took that single moment of crisis and transformed it into a lifetime of love. Their story became the standard against which other romances were measured, the proof that true love was possible even in the harsh reality of Western life, the evidence that choosing each other every day mattered more than any single grand romantic gesture. Young couples starting out would visit the old Calloway ranch and dream of building something as lasting. Old couples celebrating their own anniversaries would think of Samuel and Zelda and feel grateful for their own years together. And so the story lived on, passed from one generation to the next, a testament to the enduring power of love, to the courage it takes to save someone's life, and to the even greater courage it takes to build a life worth saving. In a land where survival was never guaranteed and comfort was hard won, Samuel and Zelda Calloway had created something rare and precious, a love that not only survived, but thrived, that grew stronger with each passing year, that became a beacon of hope for everyone who heard their tale. They had started with nothing more than a frozen creek, a rotted bridge, and one man's willingness to risk everything for a stranger. They had built an empire of love, a legacy that would endure long after the Wild West had faded into history, long after the dusty streets of Rawhide had been paved and the ranches had been divided and subdivided. They had proven that the greatest adventure was not conquering the frontier, but conquering the distance between two hearts, not claiming the land, but claiming a love worth fighting for. And in the end, that was the true story of Samuel and Zelda Calloway. Not just that he saved her life on a frozen February day in 1883, but that they spent every day afterwards saving each other in countless small ways, building something beautiful and lasting from that single moment of courage. Their love story became legend because it was true in every way that mattered, because it reminded people that heroes were not always the ones with guns and badges, but sometimes the ones who simply refused to let the people they loved drown, whether in icy water or in the struggles of daily life. And so their story endured, a bright thread woven through the tapestry of Western history, a reminder that love was the greatest adventure of all.